Hello everyone, welcome to the first actual real episode of Second Order Effects. I decided to pick a really simple one today to start with, just to get us going, and I thought I'd use the horse. Now, a horse isn't necessarily a technology, although one could argue that humans using horses actually is. So I did a bit of research, did a bit of digging around, and found out that this is in fact an enormously complicated topic. Here we go. Let's see if I can get through this without having to look at my notes, or hopefully not make anything up. Before you think to yourself, hang on, this is about technology and second order effects of technology. Well, I would argue that horses being used by humans are a form of technology. The more I did research into this topic, the more I realised how important horses have been to human society. Something that's likely to come up in this entire series is how important warfare is. I'm afraid it's just a nature of humanity that war moves us forward. Well, some of us, the ones who win, I suppose, and then everybody else gets crushed by the people with the new technology. So I thought I'd go through some of this today in a bit of detail and explain why horses have been so important and some of the technological changes with the use of horses that have really changed the world. So humans started using horses about 6,000 years ago, so about 4,000 BC. We started using horses primarily for agricultural use. We started using them in war about 4,000 years ago, and by 1500 BC, so 3,500 years ago, the Sumerians, who will turn up a lot in this series, I suspect, he started using horses with chariots in war. Now, a chariot's a great war weapon if you're on a flat field that isn't muddy, there's no trees, there's no hills, and did the Assyrians pretty good work until the Assyrians came up with the idea of using horses while actually riding them. And by about 650 BC, so 600 years after the Sumerians were using horses, the Assyrians were using horses, and they encountered the Greeks. Interesting little side note, the idea of the centaur, the half-man, half-horse, almost certainly came as a result of the Greeks seeing the Assyrians on horseback. And they were very effective, and it worked very well. And that technology basically continued through the development of saddles. The Assyrians started using saddles, and then the development by about 500 BC was the invention of stirrups. A whole long time later, 1,300 years later, Charlemagne were moving around Europe and beginning to dominate much of Central and Western Europe, and they were riding to war as cavalry, and then they would dismount to fight. That continued until the time of Genghis Khan and the Golden Horde. And the Golden Horde had this new special technology. It's called a metal stirrup. Now, a metal stirrup gave you a huge advantage over the old leather ones in that it made it a much more steady perch for you to ride with. And that particularly matters if you want to stand in the saddle and you want to use the super weapon that the Golden Horde used, which was the compound bow. And they had these new special compound bows which allowed them to sweep across all of modern Siberia, all the way really to Western Europe. The only thing that really stopped them going further than they did into Western Europe was that Genghis Khan himself died, and one of the things you had to do was take the body home to bury the man, and that was part of their culture. Now, if you really want to get a sense of how important Genghis Khan was, about 0.5% of all human beings alive today, about 16 million people, can work out that they are related to Genghis Khan in one form or another, which is a little disturbing about some of his personal habits, perhaps, but certainly an understanding of how important a couple of pieces of technology put together in a certain way can have a devastating or massive effect on not only a single society, but lots of others as well. Now, from there, The Europeans started using, or had been using, horses for a while in the sense of Charlemagne, but by the 13th, 14th century, then the whole idea of knights in armour had become a thing. This is interesting because a number of things had changed. By this point, Europe had started developing much bigger, much heavier war horses. War horses allowed you to have a heavier rider, and the heavier rider could therefore wear armour. And if you were rich enough, your horse could also wear armour. And these things became 13th century tanks. Once you got to knights in armour, normal arrows, not so effective. And getting a man off a horse is pretty hard to do. But the problem with knights in armour is they need a lot of people to look after them. A typical knight of, say, the 13th century needed on average 6 or 7 people who looked after their armour, cooked for them, helped them be put into their armour. By the way, this is where screws come from. Screws were invented to literally screw knights into their armour. I think that's an interesting aside, and we'll probably have a whole other show about screwdrivers, because that's a surprisingly interesting topic. Anyway, these knights had become incredibly powerful. A set of knights charging as cavalry against normal infantry would be a devastating weapon. And then there were 2 battles, one at the end of the 14th century, 1370-something, Battle of Crécy, and then the rather more famous Battle of Agincourt in 1415, that changed the world. The English started using, or should I really say the Welsh, started using the Welsh longbow. And the longbow had a couple of major advantages over bows that had existed before. The first one was range. A longbow of that era could have a range of up to 400 yards, about 380 metres for the metric people among you. And what that allowed the archers to do was reach all of those people who were in the French camp. So what was happening was that the arrows would bounce off a knight in armour, but it's not going to bounce off the person cooking his meal or screwing him into his armour. So, as a result, they all started getting hit by arrows, and this rather annoyed the French, as you could probably imagine. The French cavalry then charged the English lines, and the story is that the English then started firing their arrows straight at the French and pierced the French armour. Increasingly, that's likely to not actually have been the case. What they ended up doing was taking out the horses. And if you're wearing 100 pounds of armour and you've just fallen 8-10 feet off a horse to the ground at a gallop into mud, you're going to be a bit disorientated and probably a bit smashed up. So the English then ran up to them with these very thin little stiletto blades and gave them a wiggle between the plates of their armour. Highly effective way of dispatching French knights. The Battle of Agincourt, the French lost 10,000 men and the English lost 300. That really was the beginning of the end of heavy cavalry. Certainly the development of the longbow, which in itself was one thing, but you had to be well trained to use a longbow. Many of the men who used the longbow actually had deformed bodies. They've seen skeletons to show this. And so things like crossbow and then gunpowder, and of course the beginning of gunpowder weapons, really started changing the game. By this point, what the knights realised their armour was no longer of much use, and by the way, it was wildly expensive. A nice suit of armour could cost you at least $1 million in today's money, and perhaps significantly more. The cavalry then became light again because mobility became more important than protection. The next time that horses got really used in an important way was where Columbus and the rest of the conquistadors turned up in South America, and they devastated the Mayans and the Aztecs and all the other groups in South America. And partly that was disease, although that didn't kill people instantly. That normally killed them after the Spanish had been through. Partly it was steel. They had steel weapons, and the South Americans at the time were still in Stone Age or potentially Bronze Age technology. But a lot of it was because of the horse. You could literally take over a village or take over a city, and you could take over the next one before the word got to the next city that you'd even taken it. Did an incredibly I don't want to say good, that's not the right word, effective job for the Spanish of taking over South America. Once this happened more in North America, then it changed the game for the North American native tribes as well. The Native American tribes had actually all coexisted for a very long time, thousands of years, of them all having their own general patches. But with the advent of horses, it changed the game for them. Firstly, it allowed them to follow the herds of buffalo. Secondly, it allowed them to raid other tribes. This huge reshuffling of the pack for the Native Americans started happening from about 1750, and that really changed the map. So yes, the Westerners were coming in, all Manifest Destiny and all the other things with the Europeans coming over, but the Native Americans were right in the middle of also effectively a civil war. They were all trying to take over each other's stuff. It definitely weakened them relative to the Europeans. And these people became incredibly good horsemen. It allowed them to hunt very much more effectively for buffalo so they could become more powerful. And that really ended by 1870, which isn't that long ago, about 150 years. By 1870, the Europeans had got such powerful weapons that they could take out the native tribes devastatingly easily. I'm sure it's no coincidence that in 1861, Dr. Maxim invented the Maxim gun. The Maxim gun allowed you to fire as many as 600 rounds a minute. Now, that would be the equivalent of about 40 men. And that's well-trained men. It could easily be 80 men if they weren't so well-trained. You needed a crew of 4, and they could do the work of 80. And cavalry have no chance at all once guns become mechanized. So, firstly, the Maxim gun, which had some play in the American Civil War, and certainly helped stop a lot of cavalry charges there. Then it took out the remnants, unfortunately, of the Native American tribes. And then if you think forward to the Boer War and then the really big one, the First World War, it completely changed warfare. By the First World War, the cavalry charge was over. Now, one of the things you'll notice about this entire series is that technology comes in and it changes things, but it doesn't change everything everywhere all at once. It changes it in places. The future is always available, but it's not necessarily here. And this is a good example of it. Horses were not used as cavalry charges. They got cut to ribbons by machine guns in the early stages of the First World War. Then we went to trench warfare, and then it all became a defensive war because of machine guns. Having said that, there were 9 million horses used by the British alone in the First World War, so they're definitely there. And the last hurrah of cavalry was the incredibly brave use of cavalry by the Polish when the Germans invaded in 1939. The Polish cavalry were even doing charges against German blitzkriegs, which is just mind-bogglingly brave and unfortunately utterly futile. So this episode is the first one, so I'm interested in your feedback on how you feel it went. It was way more complicated than I thought it would be, and I've missed out a million details. I will put all the links that I found to build this in the description below. That's what they always say in YouTube. I don't really know where it all goes yet, but we'll work it out. I'd love to know what you'd like me to cover next. And could we have a topic that's a little less complicated than horses? I don't even like horses very much, but they sure as hell have made a huge difference to human society. If I was to leave you with one idea, it's this. That technology, whether it's riding horses or chariots or metal stirrups or machine guns or any number of other things, are in themselves not of much use. It's the combination of those technologies that really make the difference. So in your own lives, what you can do is look at various different technologies and work out how to use them in a new and completely unique way. And there is enormous power in that.